Okay. I'll put it away and then get it back out.
Yeah. That part's not as much fun as it used to be.
Yeah. Anybody can pictures back. No. This will be the second Sunday in a row that we're heavy rain. So
Yeah.
last Sunday we had rain.
Yeah.
This,
Yeah. I'm crazy about heavy rain because it happens.
it's just be that, yeah. Heavy rain would mean tons of snow. Or can we go for Thanksgiving? Oh, that's a little behind, isn't it? Get that ad off. But,
This is week 3 of last week of Mark Charles's presentation. NOAC.
So it's been 3 weeks in a row.
Yes, this will be the
This is
last
the
and
last.
final week.
This is the wrap up. So probably see his summation or summation.
Is it the same person? each time?
What's that?
I wasn't here.
Mark Charles, yes.
It's the same guys.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
sorry
it's-
for putting that.
Yeah. I love this.
I have all the confidence.
We went to the concert last night at college.
Okay.
We went to the concert at the college. Let's go home.
Yeah, that was last night, wasn't it? Yeah.
It's a mood lighting in here.
Nice.
It's a little better.
Don't turn it down too much or I'll fall asleep.
I know, and then with the heat on in here too. No napping. All right, we are going to move ahead. It'll probably overlap for about 2 minutes from where we left, 2 or 3 minutes from where we left off yesterday, just so we get our bearings. And then we will have a conversation after the conclusion of Mark Charles's presentation. Just share my screen.
Schools and the massacre at Wounded Knee. If you draw a map of our nation, this is a map of our nation in 1840. The states to the east of this map are the actual states. They're in the dark color. Everything to the west is a territory or even uncharted lands. You can look up medals of honor awarded by Congress, by war, and by conflict. And if you look up medals of honor for the Indian War campaigns, you will find that between 1839 and 1898, the United States Congress awards 425 medals of honor to U.S. soldiers who participated in the Indian War campaigns. End of the period, this is what the nation looks like. We got all the way across the continent to the Pacific Ocean. During the 19th century, the majority population balloons from 5.3 million to 76.2 million, and the native population collapses from 600,000 to 237,000. If you're doing your math, that's a 61.47% rate of genocide. If you're comparing your math, that's almost twice the rate of genocide Hitler had over the Jews in Nazi Germany. So just to be clear, between 1839 and 1898, the United States Congress awards 425 medals of honor for the genocide of American Indians and the ethnic cleansing of this continent. And we knew what we were doing. In California, in 1851, Peter Burnett, who was the first governor of California, gave his Stay the State address. And in his address, this is what he said: that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying disease has broken out and we can't stop its spread, nor is he saying famine has struck and we can't feed these people. He is literally saying we can't stop killing them until we complete our manifest destiny, which is perfectly in line with promised land theology. In Joshua 10, it says, so Joshua subdued the whole region, including the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes, together with all their kings. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Now, maybe you're thinking, Mr. Charles, that's a great story, but that's in the past. We don't think that way anymore. I want you to think back just a few years, 2015. President Obama was negotiating a nuclear deal with Iran. The Republicans and Israel did not like that deal. The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, came here to lobby against that deal, and he spoke to a joint session of Congress. That Congress back then, just like today, was completely divided. Weren't even talking to each other. And he had to unify everybody and get them on the same page politically. So early in his speech, this is what he said: because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. If you want to know why the United States of America has bipartisan, almost unanimous support for Israel, it's because we have a codependent relationship with the modern nation state of Israel. Has very little to do with freedom or equality. We need Israel's Old Testament legacy of promised land to justify what we did to Native people and African Americans. And Israel needs our flourishing as a nation with a manifest destiny to justify what they're doing to Bedouins and Palestinians. We have a very dysfunctional, codependent relationship with the modern nation state of Israel. It has almost nothing to do with freedom or equality. It's about justifying oppression. And in our case, even justifying genocide and enslavement. And this is why, to this day, white Christian nationalism is a massive, bipartisan problem that exists not in spite of our Constitution, but because of it. I am absolutely convinced that the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation I would put on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. But I would not call ours Truth and Reconciliation. Why? Because reconciliation is a misnomer. It implies there was a previous harmony. There was no conciliation in the first place. We don't need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We need a Truth and Conciliation Commission. We have to wrestle with this for the very first time. There's a quote that I love. It's by a leader, an Aboriginal leader in Canada. His name is George Erasmus. He used this quote in a letter he was writing about the the boarding school, the residential schools, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission they had there. And the quote he used said, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where communities to be formed, common memory must be created. I love this quote because it gets to the heart of our nation's problem, especially regarding race, which is we don't have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers this mythological history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. And we have communities of color that have the lived history of stolen lands and broken treaties, of enslavement and Jim Crow laws, of segregation and mass incarceration, of internment camps, families being ripped apart at our borders, and there's no common memory. And there's actually no point in our nation's history where we've had a healthy community across racial lines. It doesn't exist. In fact, this is why I ran for president in 2020. I wanted to help create this common memory. I wanted to enact and initiate this Truth and Conciliation Commission. I wanted to address our nation's problem with racism and sexism and white supremacy, not at the partisan level, at the foundational level. That's why I ran for president. And these desires flowed from my faith. These were desires I believe I had, given by God to treat all people as human and to see the humanity and the agency and the value of every single person alive in this world. But you have to ask the question, why is it 2,000 years since the death and resurrection of Christ? And not only does the world struggle to acknowledge everybody's humanity, but the church struggles to acknowledge everybody's humanity. Halfway through my campaign, 3/4 of the way through my campaign, the summer of 2020, I was wrestling with God, how do I relate to you? I'm aspiring to be president. I'm a Gentile to the Jews. I'm a savage to Western Christianity. How do I relate to you? I remember very specifically praying this prayer in my house, crying out to God, God, how do I relate to you? And sometimes you pray these prayers and you get a vision that lasts over the courses of years, and God leads you through this path and you get to a conclusion. Other times you get something very clear and you're like, was that God or last night's pizza? Right? You're like, I'm not sure. It could be one of either. And I cried out to God, how do I relate to you? And the first thought that came into my mind was the passage where Jesus is interacting with the Canaanite woman. You all know this passage. Probably some of the most dissatisfying sermons you've ever heard were preached on this passage. Right? Because somehow we as preachers find a way to make Jesus the good guy in that passage. If you don't know the passage, right, it's the story of this Canaanite woman, this Gentile woman, comes to Jesus and meets his disciples and says, I want Jesus to heal my daughter. She's possessed by a demon. The disciples send her away. She comes back tenaciously and gets to Jesus and says, I want you to heal my daughter. And Jesus says, I didn't come for you. I came for the Jews. But she doesn't give up. She comes back and says, I want you to heal my daughter. And Jesus says, why would I give to the dogs what was meant to the children? And the woman does not miss a beat. And she says, but even the dogs eat the scraps that are dropped from the table. And Jesus finally concedes. And he heals her daughter. And most sermons we preach about that passage include some kind of a wink that Jesus gave her, some kind of sparkle in his eye. He was wanting her to fight for her agency or doing something else, or he was doing something to use this. We always make Jesus look good, but I was running for president, right? And I was telling the nation, if you believe our Constitution was written to include everybody, read the document. I was telling people, get into a diverse groups of people and read our Constitution out loud, and you will be shocked and appalled at how quickly it becomes exclusive and divisive and even white supremacist. And I said, if we don't deal with what our Constitution says, we're never going to fix it. And so I thought to myself, I can't just negate what Jesus said here. I have to deal with what Jesus says, and this passage looks very clearly like Jesus is holding the ethnocentric views of his time. Right? The Jews hated the Samaritans. They were half Jews. They had sinned. They had married outside the faith. They worshiped in the wrong place, but they were related, so they had to at least respond to them. The Gentiles, they wanted nothing to do with them. They couldn't eat their food, they couldn't practice their culture, they couldn't form their ways. They were completely to be separate from them. In fact, they had gone on massive ethnic cleansing policies against Gentiles when they were taking their promised land. And so I said, what if Jesus actually said what it looks like he's saying, which is he's holding the ethnocentric views of his time. He's saying, I'm a Jewish Messiah, and I'm not supposed to relate to you. And the woman says, but even the dogs eat the crumbs. And Jesus says, you're right. And then he throws her a bone. And you know what he never does? He never corrects her. He never says, my child, you're not a dog. He doesn't say that. If you read the Gospels, whenever Jesus is impressed by someone's faith, he always, always, always gives them something more. He touches the leper. He goes home with Zacchaeus. He listens to the entire story of the bleeding woman. He goes even goes back to the village of the Samaritan woman. But for this Gentile, Jesus heals her and then just goes on his way. Does nothing outside to draw her in closer like he does when he interacts with Jewish people. So now I'm a little troubled. Because now I have a theological problem, right? Which is Jesus appears racist, or at least ethnocentric. So I decided to look through the Gospels through a framework I'd never looked at it before, which is instead of looking at Jesus through the lens of Jew versus Samaritan, I looked at Jesus at the Gospels through the lens of Jew versus Gentile. And I asked myself, how many Gentiles did Jesus interact with in the Gospels? There's the Canaanite woman, but what else? I'm really scrolling through my Bible. I find the centurion, right? Roman centurion, charged with keeping the peace, has a servant who's sick. He calls Jesus to come and heal him. Jesus is a good guy. He goes that way. The centurion knows what's going to happen if a prominent Jewish rabbi comes into his house, right? He knows it's not going to keep the peace. So he goes out, and he stops Jesus and says, you don't have to come into my house. You can do this remotely. We can fire up a Zoom session, right? You can heal her from out here. I have servants. I have people underneath me. I say to one, go, and he goes. One, come, and he comes. I know how this works. Just say the word. Jesus is amazed by his faith, and he heals the servant remotely. But he does not go any further. He goes on the way. So then I'm like, okay, well then if that's not the story where Gentiles get included, what is? Well, there's one more story with Gentiles, which is the demoniac. Jesus crosses the lake. He meets a demoniac who's living in the tombs. He heals the demoniac. The man sitting in front of Jesus in his right mind. And he's begging Jesus. Jesus gets ready to go, and the man is begging Jesus, let me follow you. And Jesus says, no. Go back to your people and tell them what God gave you today, but you may not follow me. And now I'm actually hurt. Because all of my adult life, I've imagined myself following Jesus. I've longed to be back in the first century, following Jesus, listening to his teachings, being one of his disciples. And to hear that, had I gone to Jesus as a Navajo man back in that point and asked if I could follow him, he would have said no. Not just to me, but to all of you, too. He would have said no. Now I'm actually getting desperate. I'm like, okay, God, where do I, as a Gentile, get written into this story? I go to Acts 2, which is one of the passages I always use about inclusiveness. The Holy Spirit falls on the disciples. They speak the languages of the nations. The church, the Acts 2 community, is birthed. But it says in Acts 2 that there were at that time Jews from every nation. Everyone in Jerusalem at that time was a proselyte. All the men were circumcised. Everyone ate kosher. They all went to synagogue. They all worshiped in Hebrew. Everyone, even though they were from multi-ethnic or multi-national backgrounds, they all had converted and assimilated to Judaism. It was not the radical multi-ethnic conference you were thinking of. They were all Jews, which is why they were surprised they were speaking in their own languages, because they were never used to that. They gave that up. So now I'm scrolling through the Bible. Where, God, where do I as a Gentile get included in? And I came across Acts 10. In Acts 10, Cornelius, a Roman centurion, sees a vision. He's a guy who loves God and cares for the poor. That's all we know about him. And God gives him a vision and says, go call Peter. Peter is on the rooftop praying at the time when he falls into a trance. He sees a vision of this blanket being let down in front of him. And on this blanket is all these unclean animals. And he's told by the Spirit of God to kill those animals and eat them. Now, Peter was with Jesus in Mark chapter 6 when Jesus declared all foods were clean. He was there. But here in Acts 10, Peter definitively says, never, Lord, I've never eaten anything unclean. We might have said that stuff was clean. We never ate it. And it's true. Read the Gospels. There's no example of Jesus eating unclean food with Gentiles. It doesn't happen. But Peter sees this vision 3 times. Finally, he's compelled to go to Cornelius' house when the people come. So he goes back with them to their house. He walks into Cornelius' home. He doesn't say, this is okay, this is fine. I remember Jesus did this with the Roman centurion, because Jesus never went into his home. So Peter walks into Cornelius' house and says, I shouldn't be here. You're a Gentile, I'm a Jew. I'm not supposed to be here. Tell me why you called for me. Cornelius tells him the story. Peter begins to preach to Cornelius and his family. As he's preaching, he sees the same spirit that God gave the Jews in Acts 2, now falling on uncircumcised Gentiles. And he is blown away. And he says, there is nothing to prevent me from baptizing these people. And the circumcised believers who were with Peter were astounded and said, even the Gentiles are included in this salvation that leads to life. They were blown away. They had no clue that their message was to be brought to uncircumcised Gentiles. The way you expanded Judaism was through proselytes. You expanded through marriage or through people converting and assimilating and becoming Jewish. You didn't go out and evangelize. It was a very long process to become a Jew. So when Jesus gave them this vision to bring the gospel to the nations, their whole framework for that was through proselytes. And Jesus never once interacted at length with uncircumcised Gentiles. The 3 in the Gospels, he held all of them at arm's length. Anyone even remotely close to Judaism, he welcomed in and went even beyond what they expected. But with Gentiles, he healed them, but he kept them at arm's length. You see, we have 2 theologies of Jesus. A big portion of the church, not all the church, and I'm not talking just the church of Brethren, but most churches, they see that the point of reconciliation between God and between Creator and people happens at the cross, right? This is why most churches celebrate communion. They see something pivotal happened at the cross, where God and creation are reconciled in some manner. And we preach that, and we even confess that when we take communion. But we preach Jesus, the Gospels, like that reconciliation happened at the birth. And even though Jesus tells us, I'm a Jew, I'm a Jewish Messiah, I came for the Jews, we have this, and I'm going to call it a heresy, that Jesus loved everybody. When he didn't, right? If you were the Canaanite woman, yeah, you got what you wanted, you didn't feel loved. You were called a dog, right? Jesus held them around. Jesus didn't come to keep the morality of the first century, even the morality of 2023 perfectly. He came to keep Old Testament law perfectly. And Old Testament law required him to be separate from the Gentiles. So the church, as it wrestled, especially the white European Christian church, it had to wrestle with this, right? Because you are just as much of a Gentile as me. Had you come to Jesus in the first century, you would have been told to go home. Had you met the God of Israel in your homeland, where the people of Israel are supposed to take their promised land, you too would have been ethnically cleansed and wiped out, just like my people would have. Right? This is what would have happened. So how did European nations and the church wrestle with that teaching that says, yeah, Jesus came for the Jews? Where did we get this theology that Jesus loved everybody? Right? One of the examples, we see it most clearly in the Gospel of John, but the Gospel of John is one of the few Gospels that contains no interactions with Jesus and Gentiles. So if you want to have a theology that says Jesus loves you, not just died for you, not just came for you, not just reconciled you back to God, but actually loves you, you have to do one of two things. You either have to become Jewish, or you have to make Jesus look like you. So what did Western Christianity do? It made Jesus white. Now, because Jesus is white, Western Christians can treat savages the same way Jesus treated Gentiles, and you're not sinning because that's what Jesus did. When Jesus was comforting his disciples, right? He said, I'm going away. He said, that's a good thing for you, because it means I can send you the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God will dwell in you, and the Spirit of God will empower you to do even greater things than I did. Now, we think that's hyperbole. But what Peter did in Acts 10 was absolutely greater than anything Jesus did in his earthly ministry, because he baptized uncircumcised Gentiles into the church. He went against what he saw Jesus model. He went against what he was told as a Jewish man. He went against what he was taught in the synagogues and prayed in the temple. And when he saw the Spirit of God falling on uncircumcised Gentiles, Peter went with reckless abandon and ran to where the Spirit of God was and embraced who the Spirit of God was embracing, and brought in this whole new demographic of people that had never, ever before been included, even by Jesus, into the community. God was doing something new. God was doing something new. And it was only by following the Spirit of God who was dwelling within them that Peter was able to embrace it. And these are the two challenges I want to give to you today. God did something new. With the sending of Jesus, God did away with the understanding of Christian empire. The United States of America is not, never has been, nor will it ever be Christian. That is not the goal. That was never the goal. God did not want his church his people to plant an empire. He wanted them to build a church. And Jesus was very clear that after him, the Spirit of God was going to come and was going to do something even newer than what he did. And if the disciples knew what was good for them, they were going to follow that. And that's exactly what happened in Acts 10. And both times, the people of God and the followers of Jesus said, no, we don't want that. We would rather have our empire, and we would rather have our ethnocentric churches. We don't like this new thing that God did, and we're going to therefore reject it and keep doing the same old thing. And so, my brothers and sisters, I want to challenge you today to embrace the new thing that God did 2,000 years ago. I want you to open your eyes and to actively look where the Holy Spirit is, what the Holy Spirit's doing, and to go and run there with reckless abandon. And I want you to give up and to shed any understanding of the heresy of a Christendom or a Christian empire. This new thing God's doing is about relationship. It's not about institutions and empire. This new thing that God's doing is radically inclusive and not defined by our small, narrow-minded selves. And I pray that as a denomination, as a conference, as individuals, you will be able to get on board with the new thing that the creator of the universe and the spirit of that creator is doing, and to see where we end up. Walk in beauty, my relatives, and may we all learn how to walk in this beauty together. Ahiat.
Right? So, look at the lights here. I'd be interested to hear some reactions, thoughts, maybe raw feelings from what was shared by Mark Charles here.
Just a question.
Yeah.
That was at NOAC this last year, or?
Yeah.
I didn't get where it was.
Yeah, it was at the NOAC conference. Is that in June?
September,
Was it in September?
Labor Day.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. It was much earlier than that.
And
But
what
it's always
does he
after that.
do outside of that? I mean, he's a pastor someplace, or?
He wrote a book. He's an author, I think like an activist. I'm not sure that he's a church pastor. Does anyone know?
I don't think he's a pastor.
Yeah, I don't think he is a
No, I haven't
pastor.
heard.
Yeah, he might just be kind of a public theologian, sorts.
Did somebody say it's something to do with Millersville? Did I hear that wrong? Nothing?
I don't think he's from Millersville.
Oh, then it must have been somebody else.
He maybe has spoken there though. I don't know.
I think Arizona
Yeah.
or Chicago. I don't know. My response was just very raw. It was, when I heard it the first time, it was just, and for me, it was, yeah. It put me in a position of being that outsider.
Hmm.
Jesus would not accept him, would not have accepted him if he was living in Jesus' time. And to me, and for me, personally, it was an experience of a little bit of a taste of the experience that my husband has as an outsider in our nation. And it helped me understand him better. I like the way he ended it about relatives. He called us all relatives. And we are. That's, when you think about it. But we talk about family. Family sometimes gets, yeah, we do that all the time. We talk about family. When we talked about relatives, it just kind of struck me.
I thought it was interesting how confusing the Bible is and how he said that we always make it positive, like Jesus never sinned, never made a mistake, and we always make it look like he did the right thing, and how we make that, whatever he did, into the right thing. And how does that fit with us today? And I don't know.
Yeah, I too find that challenging, provocative, worthy of consideration to think about. Particularly, I think from his perspective, because my initial gut reaction is to kind of like push back against that as someone who's grown up in the church and has, thought a lot about my relationship to Jesus and what Jesus is like. And I think one of the things that was interesting was considering how I have made Jesus into my own image, my own white, Western, cultural kind of image, and how distant that must be from a 2,000-year-old person who lived in the Middle East. So yeah, I think it's hard for me to unpack some of that.
I had often thought in past years of that story as a step that Jesus was learning who he was and who his relationship with these people needed to be. And that was just, and that Jesus was learning all along. It wasn't that he came as perfect. He came as a person, as a human being, and a human being is not perfect. And we have to learn, and Jesus was learning. And God was doing a new thing in Jesus. And then God was doing a new thing in Peter.
So does that mean God is learning as well?
Yes.
And
That's what process theology, I think, is that telling us.
and we don't think like, or we try not to think like that God always does it right.
But what, in terms of a relationship with God, I don't know where yes, I do know where Catherine Keller, thank you. In her book on process theology, talks about any kind of relationship you have with anyone changes both people. So my relationship with you, you would change and I would change. And God wants relationship with people. And if God's in a relationship with people, then God is changing.
But is that what we want to believe? I mean,
Well,
we
that's
know-
right.
Yeah, maybe we
Yeah.
know.
But it's a different way of looking at God's being perfect.
But it is hopeful in a sense, because we often have thought, well, since Jesus, everything's been downhill. But there was a really important uphill there in Acts 10. And so to think that who knows what else is ahead, even without Jesus here physically present, something greater could have happened in the church. That gives us a whole new understanding of the potential of the church. I don't know if it's the UCC church or the Methodist that has a tagline, don't put a comma where God, don't put a period where God put a comma, God is still speaking.
UCC.
In a membership class for Church of the Brethren, used to read Wayne Zuckel's thing, and he would talk about how brethren interpret the scriptures. He would say, well, the Old Testament is seen through the eyes of the New Testament. The New Testament is seen through the eyes of Jesus, and brethren think of Jesus as Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount. Now, after seeing this and hearing him in NOAC, I want to put Peter there. I want to put Acts 10 right there beside it, because it has to be there. I mean, that just, it opened it up to me now. That Sermon on the Mount isn't enough.
And then in our Bible study at NOAC with Chris Booker and Bob Neff, they also talked about Philip and the eunuch and God doing a new thing there. What were the others? Remember? I guess it might be.
Joyce and I finished watching The Crown last night. The very last episode of that whole, seems like decade-long saga. And of course, the whole monarchy thing is, see, I grew up European white framework, Westernized white. We're the best nation in the world. Learned it in high school, social studies class in grade school. Barely mentioned slavery. I was one of the privileged, so you see, just getting that out of my gizzard as the default position. I mean, I learned very early that there's questions with that, but when you learn something, it's in your gizzard. I always have to retranslate and say, now just, Ralph, that's white privilege, that's male privilege, that's heterosexual privilege. Because I live in that when I walk out the door every day. The privilege part. I have to think about what that, I mean, I have to, it's ongoing, it's every day that I have to readjust.
And look who helped us, an outsider. We need the outsiders to understand our faith. We need the outsiders to understand our country, be able to see the parts of it that are not so good. And also to suggest how to do things differently. They're a gift.
Yeah.
They're not a burden we have to drag along. They're a gift that we need to be honest with ourselves about our country and our faith.
I guess the question is, how do we do that? I mean, how do we make a difference? And obviously, we can't make a big difference, but in our small world, what can we do differently? And just give an example, I do mediation as a application, and I was doing a training of mediators, and it was an all-white group. There's one black guy in there. And someone asked me in the question and answer period, how do I take culture into effect when I do mediation? And I said, I don't know. I don't think I do. I mean, I take it as it comes, and I don't preconceive any idea about culture. And the one black person was offended by my answer. And so he told the other trainer about it. So the other trainer and I got us two together, and he shared, he told me how he felt about the situation. And there was really, sort of, and I was thinking, how do I take culture? Do I want to have a preconceived idea or whatever? And I didn't know how to do that, but I obviously had offended him because I wasn't, I think, I didn't say it this way, but he was offended and he sort of felt invisible if he would have been a participant in one of my mediations. And so now what I've done in a pre-mediation phone call, I ask both parties, is culture a factor in this mediation? Should I be thinking like that? And I don't want to assume that it might be, even though I might have a black and a white participant, but I'm asking them, is there something I should be aware of regarding the culture? And then if there is, then I'll pursue that. But again, it's just a small little thing that I can do differently, hopefully to make people more comfortable in my awareness of their needs and stuff like that. But I think, I think there's all kinds of things every day we can do differently to take that into consideration.
Yeah.
think one of the interesting things for me is how I have realized where I've kind of inserted myself into the story and how I've kind of seen where I would be in the story and make assumptions about power and privilege. When we read the Exodus story, we always kind of insert ourselves as being the Hebrew people who are with Moses fleeing, as opposed to the Egyptians or those who are in power over the Hebrew people. Or in this story, that maybe we see ourselves as the Canaanite woman who just wants healing from Jesus, and that's us coming to Jesus, as opposed to being the disciples who are kind of like, get out of here, don't bother our Savior right now. And I just think, when you had mentioned about how where we're hearing the story and who is telling the story, I think it's a helpful reminder for me that outside voices, people being willing to hold up a mirror for a different perspective can be helpful in trying to untangle some of this that is just so ingrained in how I've come to understand the story that it's hard to unpack it. And unpacking it feels really uncomfortable.
That's what I was just gonna say. It is really uncomfortable. I live with it. It's very uncomfortable.
But it needs the community. His quote is way in the beginning. I know I'm not convincing you it's worth doing, but his quote way in the beginning that we can't have community if we don't have shared history. So it's really worth doing because we don't even know what healing feels like. I learned from Christians in Central America that the Exodus story is a really, really key biblical story. I mean, I've grown up in the Church of the Brethren, there's the David story, and there's the Samson story, and there's this story, and there's the Exodus story. No, that is a really, really key story in the whole Christian faith, freeing people from bondage. And I never saw it that way till I heard it from Christians in Central America who are poor, who are oppressed by a lot of things we do here. We would need to hear about ourselves from.
Yeah, that, I'm reminded of a learning I had a long time ago. 2 years I was in Ecuador with the Quechua Indian people. The last Sunday I was there, I preached a sermon in Spanish. Okay, and we were part of Bible studies the whole time. And it's a whole different thing to study the Bible with Quechua native peoples than with white people in the United States. It's like they didn't have to psychologize it. This was their life. And the 4 years I was a pastor in the inner city of Chicago with Black and Hispanic and poor white, I didn't have to psychologize the Beatitudes or the stories, the parables. I mean, this was their life. I just told the story and it was it was right there. And it was easy. That was fun. Going back and preaching to white people then, that was hard. I mean, how to be authentic.
The Black church, that Exodus story is the prime story. And Eddie would say all the horrible things that happened to the blacks that were brought, the Africans that were brought to America by the whites. And the one good thing the white people did was show us the story of the Exodus.
Sometimes. Other times it was whitewashed out of the
Exactly.
Bible.
I can thank.
Maybe I couldn't hear what you said. The one good thing, like you think is what?
Give us the story of the Exodus.
The story is.
Well, that, all, liberation theology is built on the Exodus being central story, but a lot of the European theologians kind of look down on, well, these people weren't educated in German seminaries. What do they know, but they're seeing our faith more accurately than we are.
Where is that video about? I didn't see the previous part. I gather you showed it was longer than what we saw.
Yeah, it was the videos from NOAC, and it's on our adult faith formation YouTube page. I was able to get it from the denominational offices.
And how long is it previous? I mean,
There are three kind of,
90 minutes?
yeah, about 90 minutes each. There's the video that I have uploaded, there's some other stuff like announcements about NOAC and some silly videos and stuff before it even gets past it. They always have those two guys.
This was a morning talk and it went for an hour and a half.
Was that surprisingly long or?
No, all of the
Okay.
keynote speakers were.
They were all that long.
It was, yeah.
From,
We didn't go to sleep.
yeah, well, I'm curious, how that was received at NOAC. I mean, was it largely?
Oh, just like you're hearing us.
And I think everybody wanted to talk about it. They
Mhm.
wanted to share where they were
Unpack it.
coming. What,
Yeah.
what were the key points that you heard? What did you hear? You really needed to interact with people after that. You just couldn't sit and just think. You really need to see, where were you on this? And one of my questions I have is, I really wish I would have gone to one of his sessions later on, but I wanted to know why in 2020 he decided to run for
Mhm.
president. And I really would love to know why he thought that that was an important avenue to do. Knowing the circumstances of what was going on.
Mhm.
And how would our presidency be different if someone like that was in place? What would happen? And what would people do? I mean, would there be rebellions?
Well, it would have been a way to quickly get more publicity for his. Yeah, or,
I did speak to him afterwards. Because I wanted to tell him how I'm impressed, how that story impressed me, just like I told you. And he said he struggled with that story of the Canaanite woman
Mhm.
for a year and a half before he was able to preach it.
Yeah, it's challenging. It's challenging for me. I imagine that that sermon would not sit well in many congregations.
The NOAC gathering, people in the gathering were very motivated with those ideas. It's a very progressive.
Yeah, that would fly better at NOAC than it would at annual conference.
So, yeah,
I mean, having been at annual conference and talking about the doctrine of discovery was a topic, was one of the items of new business to talk about this past. And you could just tell that there was unease within the room of talking about those things. I think people just felt uncomfortable talking about it. Most people who were coming from more assumptions, but more conservative church backgrounds were in a place that's like, why are we even doing this? This is like, we need to be talking about, things that are,
Praise Jesus.
yeah, like, let's talk about more how we're gonna do better evangelism, how we're gonna do, and at my own table, there was just some pushback against some of the terms that were in, like just how the topic was being talked about in general. And I think it continues to be a challenge for people to hear critique about things we hold dearly.
I have to go to rehearsal, but I will say that I am reading the book Power of the Kingdom and Glory. Have you heard of that?
What's the name
It's about white Christian nationalism, basically.
The
It's
power,
about,
the
it's
kingdom,
about
and the glory.
evangelical Christians and how they have come to support Trump. And it's just the opposite of everything that he was.
Mhm.
What's the name of the book again?
Power of the Kingdom and the Glory.
By
Kingdom, the power. Sorry.
Timothy,
who?
Alberta.
Is this a critique of that or a support of
It's
it?
a.
Oh, it's critique.
Oh,
He-
okay.
Critique in the
He
same
grew up,
thing.
he grew up as a Christian evangelical. But,
He's describing the church
describing
as a totally misunderstanding the power of the kingdom.
he does interview after interview after interview of pastors
Mhm.
in that. During all.
What's his
during
name?
that.
His name,
His name,
Timothy Albert.
Timothy Albert.
Alberta, like, Canada. I was going.
Yeah, you can find interviews with that.
But that would be a very, very
Terry
interesting
Bruce,
book for him.
on point also.
Julie, I want to see you at the church. I got something to give you.
Okay.
So for anybody who wasn't here earlier, he has a book coming out, right?
Yeah.
On
Yeah, Mark,
decolonizing
yeah,
faith,
decolonizing
which
faith.
I really want to read because that's his response to this.
He has a current book out,
Un-
Unsettling Truth, Unsettled Truths, Unsettling Truths. Unsettling.
You had it here.
Yeah. Yeah, there's actually, I don't know if there is, maybe someone got it, but out in our racial justice library, there's a copy out in Memorial Lobby. Someone has to check it out.
Jason, I want to underline, you talked about Edge Conference and the Doctrine of Discovery that you talked about there. And at first, I kind of did a little guffaw, and then I thought, no. I mean, that's good. I mean, that our denomination, at Edge Conference, where there's a diversity of people, where not everybody's of the same mind, to have that discussion is exactly what needs to happen. Because we can't just talk about things in our own silos. And that's mixing it up in our larger family. And I just think that that's great.
That might be the first time a lot of those people ever heard that.
Right.
Mhm.
And I was shocked that that was even on the table we talked about. That was,
Mhm.
I mean, I was glad. And I was glad.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that onto that, the way for, to me, the way forward is to be in places and spaces where we're saying things that reframe what is happening into a way that gives new perspectives like we're talking about. Because if we just talk with like-minded people, we're not getting anywhere.
And a lot of the rest of the world knows this stuff. It's us that doesn't know it. I mean, the Native Americans know it, the Black people know it, the Central Americans, they know this about us, but we're blind to it.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, privilege allows for us to not have to even like think about it. But I think there's also, a piece that it fiercely defends it too. You know, as I said, just my own immediate reaction to what he's saying. I can see how there would be plenty of people who would push back strongly against that. As defenders of the faith, you know, in standing on, you know, in their minds coming from a good place. And I can see that, and the challenges that exist for when we are steeped within a system where power, who has access to it, who gets to decide. Those things matter. Anyone have any final thoughts?
I'm just gonna sort of echo what Julie said. You know, I played basketball and I've been in gyms where I'm the only white guy and never felt out of place and all that. But when I was at Millersville, I was getting my master's degree and I was head of the dorm, and my job also was to have activities in the dorm. And we'd have dances and 20 people would show up. They're always a failure. The guy across the hall was a black guy and said, "You ought to come to one of our dances. We get 200 or 300 people." I said, there's only 200 or 300 blacks on campus. I mean, how do you get 200 or 300 people coming? So I said, sure. So I went to one of their dances, and as soon as I walked in, I felt out of place. I felt that people were looking at me like, why am I here? And no one said anything or did anything that would have made me, that I could say, well, they did that, and that's why I felt it. It was just like, you know, and I asked a couple people to dance, and they said, okay, but I could sort of feel they didn't really want to dance with me and all that stuff. And it was sort of like the first time I think that I had a little bit of an understanding what a black person might go through. You know, everybody thinking, well, what are they thinking of me as a black person here? Are they racist or they're not racist and all that? And I sort of had like I say, it was just a small piece of what a black person might go through on our campus or in our world. And it was sort of eye-opening to me to help me understand that a little bit. The people I danced with were friends of mine outside of that situation. I mean, they were people I knew and had good relationships with. And again, I just felt they didn't want to connect with me there. They didn't want to see me dance with me, even though what would other people think of them, you know, and all that kind of stuff. Really sort of eye-opening.
Yeah, and I guess we're better off for being in those awkward situations, you know, because we get to experience that. And yet sometimes I know my tendency is to like avoid a situation that would be an ability to learn or experience something new. To be open to that. Hold lightly those opportunities. Well, as I mentioned, next week, we will not be meeting together. If you want to come, you are welcome to be here early. People will be hanging out in Memorial Lobby. You don't need to show up right at 10:30. You can still come. The lights will be on, the doors will be unlocked. You can come a little early.
Ready.
But we're not going to have any formal class.
Okay.
I haven't heard. I bet it's released.
Released?